Hi friends, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the process, colours and everything behind this little harvest mouse drawing. So we're going to be using some trusty coloured pencils for this piece. I've used all Polychromos colours and I'm using the Fabriano Artistico hot pressed £140 extra white watercolour paper. Everything I've used for this piece is actually listed in the description below for you. The reference for this is also kindly used with permission from Julie Hunt, and if you want to use it and follow along in real time with this tutorial, then the full process is available on Patreon and also on my website as well. Let's get stuck into this piece. Now, the hardest and most time-consuming part of this piece was actually the wheat, and that we will actually get to in a minute, but we're going to talk about the mouse first. So for the mouse itself, I started with the eye, and the reason I do this is because it's always good to start with the main features so that you have a good solid anchor to add other parts to. I always start with the eyes also because it gives the piece a little bit of character. And I used a sharp dark sepia pencil to gently outline, and then I used a firmer pressure to fill in the black-like colour. And I mixed in a little bit of walnut brown and dark indigo to create my own unique black tone for this. I like to mix these three colours together for dark areas rather than go in with straight black, as it adds depth and it's a lot more of like a warmer feeling as well. I also added a touch of burnt sienna in places around the highlight of the eye to capture the light in the eye. So even though the eyes look quite black, they're actually a very dark brown, and when the light hits them you can kind of catch like amber undertones, so that's what the burnt sienna is replicating there. I then moved on to the next feature of the mouse, which is the nose, and the nose was made by lightly layering some light flesh and alizarin crimson and gently darkening the nose creases before adding in some walnut brown. The nose is actually a really simple process and it just requires gentle shading. I use a circular motion with my pencils here as well to help flatten out and even the tone in the area. And you just want to use your darker red, so for me it was an alizarin crimson, just to kind of accent those nose creases. The fur for the mouse actually consists of a first layer of warm grey 1, and it's important with this layer that you get that fur direction in and also the length. You want to add shading down with this and make sure the length of your shading strokes aren't too long. The mouse has short fur, so depending on the actual size of your drawing, you want to keep the strokes about the same size of the eye is what I was kind of going for. A second layer is then added of light flesh, and this helps to create that peachy undertone of the fur. The first grey layer helps to even out the red tones in the light flesh and helps the flesh tone appear a little bit more orange. You want to keep your shading short for this layer once again and make sure that you're following that fur direction. Your midtones are where you will start to add in the texture, and you want to switch from shading to adding in light fur lines with a sharp pencil. To build up the tones in the fur, I've used a mixture of terracotta, burnt ochre and raw umber, and every now and then I'll go in and shade so that the tones are nice and even as well. Where there are darker tones on the mouse, I build up the midtones a little bit more and increase the pressure on the pencils in order to get more of that pigment down. I then take a nougat pencil and start to add in some darker lines and details to the fur. When it comes to adding in darker details like this, you want to keep them quite far apart and make sure you don't cluster your lines together, and also make sure that you don't add too many. The idea here is to give the impression of the shadows between each of the fur strands. Adding too many lines and too close together will make the fur look really muddy and will ultimately turn brown. You want to keep it nice and vibrant, so use your darker colours lightly and sparingly. You can add the final layer of details with a walnut brown, but remember to only add this where you can see elements of shadow between the fur. I also like to take the nougat and the walnut brown and add tiny little wisps of fur coming off the top of the head and around the body. You want to keep the lines and edges kind of broken, and what I mean by that is so that you have lines coming off rather than a straight coloured line around the top or the edge of your figure. So let's be honest, having like really coloured areas right up to the edge looks totally unrealistic. So if you have an animal at home as well, take a look at their silhouette and notice all of the tiny little tufts of fur sticking out that break up their sort of outline. Those last few steps are the basic foundation for the whole of the fur on this little guy, and I just followed those, working from the base layer and building up the tones and pressure to build into the darker colours. You'll notice on these types of small animals that they often have little clumps of fur that stick together, or where they're like wet or where they've groomed themselves, and you get these kind of darker underlayers showing through, and that is where you have an exception to the previous step of adding the darker fur strokes sparingly. In those darker clumps, you do want to stick your fur lines closer together, and a little hack I have for you is to look at the shape that the dark section is making and try and mimic that shape by gently shading your dark colour down, and then once you're happy you can use more layers or a harder pressure to add that section in. If you're working in that way, you'll want to blend the shape out as well, and that's where you bring in those light sporadic fur lines. So you want to concentrate fur lines closer together around the very edge of the dark shape, and then as you get further out into the lighter fur, you want to move your fur strokes further apart and get lighter with the pressure on your pencil. You'll also want to make sure you keep an eye out for more grey toned areas on your mouse. The back of the mouse tends to be a nice warm gingery tone, whereas the belly of the mouse will be a lighter white or grey. I'm speaking generally here, as well as this won't apply to all mice or rodents. Where you do have slightly more grey areas, you want to keep the orange tones or any tones present on the back of the mouse to a minimum. This is generally the mid-tones as well that we're talking about here, so those ochre colours. You'll want to use those darker tones that you used in the kind of the back of the fur for shading those, so you keep a nice symmetry in the palette as you work in each area. For the feet of the mouse, you want to use the same tones as you did in the nose. So all of those pinky, flesh-toned areas will require the same tones and shading. The texture for the feet is different to the fur, and for those areas I've used more of a circular motion rather than shading back and forth, as this will give you a nice smooth surface and even out the tone. The feet are similar in texture to kind of human skin, and using that different motion with your pencil will help you to identify that. So remember to keep your dark pink tones as well in the darker areas or the shadows of the feet and the hands. The tail of the mouse is probably the easiest to add in, and this can be created by adding in light shaded layers, gradually moving from light to dark as you do work in coloured pencil. I started with an ivory base, then added in some of that light flesh to create a peach-like tone. I kept these layers super light, and you can still see the slight grain of the paper through these layers. I then blended everything out with a white pencil and knocked back the colours a little bit. I then shaded in some of the shadows with the nougat and the walnut brown, and I also added in a little bit of the alizarin crimson so that the nose, hands and feet and now the tail were all kind of tied together. Just the action of shading back and forth vertically down the tail is enough to convey that subtle texture. If your particular reference has a little bit more texture though, you can exaggerate that by adding in more shading, and mice tend to have like little bands running down the length of their tail, and adding in like a little curved lines from edge to edge will be spot on for that. So that's all the kind of steps that I took for the mouse. So now I'm just going to give you guys some tips for drawing wheat and other kind of similar textures and types of plant. As the wheat is yellow toned, I added a base of ivory down first and then worked into my darker tones. Layering on this was created by using that kind of circular motion and gently working the pencil over the paper. For the entirety of the wheat, I kept my base layers nice and light, and with the darker layers I introduced a little heavier pressure. It's a lot easier to tackle this kind of texture by going one ear at a time, and I'm defining ear here as each like little teardrop or oval shaped section of the wheat. And to define them, I just took a cream pencil and gently worked into the point of the ear, and the point is the area which meets the other ears at the bottom of each shape as you look at the piece. This is where all of the shadows collect, and this is also the place where it's going to hold all of our other darker colours. I define a lot of these ears before going in and darkening further, so I just map out each of the shapes. To darken them further, I used some Naples ochre and some green gold to convey these really nice golden tones. I then go in with a little nougat to help define the shadows, and it's with this colour that I work into the lighter tips of the ears a little. And I focus a harder pressure on the nougat pencil right in the V of the ear where the ears sit next to one another. All of these layers are created by using that circular or more like of a oval shading technique, along with generic back and forth shading motions as well. I then take some more of that nougat and a little bit of walnut brown to add in any kind of defining marks on each of the little ears. You'll notice when looking at this particular type of plant that it's often covered in tiny dark dots, or it may have some kind of like dark imperfections. So to add these in, make sure your pencils are super sharp so you can get those crisp fine details in. You want to follow the same process all the way down the wheat, really making sure that you pay attention and hype up the saturation of the shadows between each little section of the wheat. That's what's really key here, and if you do that, you'll end up with a super realistic looking texture. You can blend every now and then with a white pencil, or you can even go back over with some of your base tones like the cream, the ivory, or even a little bit of light flesh. This will help to keep everything super smooth, even out that texture and even out the tones in your pencil layers as well. Make sure that you keep the tips of your wheat section lighter than the base, and you should be good to go for this. It's also a really good idea to have both a colour and a black and white image open when you're doing this kind of texture so that you can see exactly where the darker tones need to be placed. Trust me, I always offer a black and white photo to my students and have one open when working, as it's such a simple and invaluable tool to use. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you found some of these tips really helpful when creating your own little mice and these types of textures, and this can be applied to pretty much any rodent, or even if you have anything with kind of short sandy coloured fur. And of course, if you're working on something that's slightly different coloured, you don't have to use my colour suggestions, but you can use the techniques that I suggested for shading and everything. If you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload, as I post new arty goodness every single Friday for you guys. I have some other videos coming out alongside my usual coloured pencil videos too, so make sure you hit the notification bell so that you can be first to watch those as well. That's all from me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!